Is the criminal justice system doing enough to speed up prosecutions of corruption cases? And what needs to be done to protect whistleblowers? Joining me now to talk about this is legal expert, advocate Romeo Nthambeleni, active citizens movement member Adila Chohan, as well as Wayne Duvenage, CEO of the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. Advocate, good to have you with us on In Focus. Wayne and Adila, good evening and thank you very much for joining us. Let's start right there. I mean, the testimony of Athol Williams. He says when he realized that his risk has gone high, the organization gave him an advice and they said, listen, the only advice or the only option that you have is to leave the country. Is that the only option that whistleblowers have?
Yeah, no, thank you and good evening, Thabo, and the viewers. I think it's quite important for us to place in focus it is no issue that these whistleblowers cannot be protected by legislation alone. There must be an active participation of the law enforcement agencies in relation to protection of whistleblowers. And we have given an example there of the assassination of Babita, which brought this whole exercise into play. So I think it's quite important that the law enforcement agencies must really take this very seriously and start protecting the people, because at the end of the day, you will never be protected by legislation. You need to be protected by real people. While you are facing the barrel of the gun, no legislation will actually protect you. We have seen it with Babita, and there are many more who are in the cold. Every time when the public protector speaks on these issues, she refers to one fikile. It's either you are going to have that situation or you are completely isolated.
Yeah.
The private sector does not want to touch you. The government does not want to touch you. Where are you going to end living your life in fear for standing up for good and standing up for ethics and morality? So we find ourselves in a very difficult situation.
Adila, I mean, so much has been said around the safety of whistleblowers. So much has been said about whistleblowers living in fear, particularly coming out of the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture and the things that were revealed there by whistleblowers. Yet, up till this point, you get, for example, testimony of Athol Williams, very useful testimony, and the man, he says he's been given no protection and continues to live in fear. What is it that is not being done and what more needs to be done?
Good evening everyone, and thank you for having me. In my opinion, the problem is there isn't sufficient legislation in place. We have the Protected Disclosure Act, but it does not provide sufficient protection to the employee. And that is why you have employees like William Athol that has found himself in a position where he had to flee the country. It's because the employer, once the whistleblower has exposed fraud and corruption, the employer then tends to victimize the employee. And the employee is left out in the cold without any financial assistance, without any support, psychological support. They are left alone in terms of still having to look after their family. The legislation has to change in order to ensure that employees are protected. And in some instances, you would have to look at criminalizing the actions of the employers to ensure that whistleblowers come forward. If whistleblowers are continued to be victimized and managed out of the country, like what happened to Athol, then we are going to face a serious problem in South Africa where corruption will not be exposed. And that is also in keeping with what happened to Babita Deokaran.
Yeah.
She was murdered because she was exposing fraud and corruption within the health department. And yet there was no protection. And yet we were aware that her life was threatened. And in the same instance, William has also said that his life has been threatened. But there isn't sufficient means to protect them in this country.
Is there international best practice that we can learn from in what needs to be inserted into our legislation that is currently missing? Many people will say we probably watch too many movies and see how the FBI, for example, conducted their witness protection. They change your identity. They can give you a whole new life, move you with your family, and you almost disappear off the face of the earth. And they say, well, why don't we do that? Why don't the Hawks do that for South African whistleblowers?
You definitely hit it on the nail, because there isn't no witness protection program for whistleblowers. There is a witness protection program for actual criminals that turn on one another or to give evidence, and then they have this whole program that will protect the witness in that instance. But in the case of whistleblowers in South Africa, there is no such program. Interestingly enough, internationally in the USA, they have got a little bit more protection that is offered to the whistleblowers. They actually put it under occupational health and safety, that where whistleblowers are protected to ensure there's no detriment to their employment. There is also in Malaysia, where it is a criminal offense, that where if employers take adverse actions against employees, they can be arrested for things of that nature. But in South Africa, we don't have those kind of legislations in place to protect the whistleblower.
When there are two pillars to the question. One is the speed at which cases of corruption are being resolved. So, for example, Ethel Williams saying, of the things that he revealed at the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, he doubts that any of it has actually been properly investigated or even arrests being effected. And now that puts the question to the speed at which cases are being resolved after the whistleblower has actually blown the whistle. And then you're taking long to finalize the case, yet you're not giving the individual whose risk now has gone higher protection.
Yeah. Exactly. I think Ethel raises a serious point, and we are equally concerned. You know, the new administration has been in for 2.5 years now, since May 2019. We were very hopeful. We have new leadership within the NPA, within the Independent Directorate, within SARS, within many of these oversight institutions. And we sit here 2.5 years later, going into 2022, with a decade of state capture and more, and very little has happened when you unpack it. And yet the evidence is overwhelming. The Zondo Commission has revealed a lot of information, but it's not just in the Zondo Commission. Organizations like ourselves and others have given referrals to the prosecuting authorities. There's so much evidence, and yet the perpetrators of serious, massive crime are still walking the streets as if there's nothing wrong with their lives, and they should have been in court a long time ago. Now, we understand these institutions have been hollowed out and it takes time to fix them, but this is 2.5 years down the road, and something is fundamentally wrong. And how long it takes, we've got so much evidence, and yet we seem to want to have a book of evidence. You need one issue sometimes just to hold somebody to account and send them to prison for 15 years. And yet we want to have 10 issues. So we've got a problem with the speed at which prosecutions are taking place in this country.
Duvenage and Adila, Chohan, as well as Advocate Nthambeleni, they stay on with us. Continue in a moment on In Focus in this conversation. Back with you tonight on In Focus, the challenges faced by Ethel Williams, bringing back into the spotlight the question of the protection of whistleblowers, but not only that, justice for victims of state capture, but also seeing those who committed these crimes being held to account and put behind bars. We have with us Advocate Romeo Nthambeleni, Adila, Chohan, as well as Duvenage in this conversation. So, Advocate, justice for state capture, many people were hopeful. Even Wayne saying, well, new administration's been in now for at least 2 years. Yeah. We were hoping to see more people in orange overalls, but we are not seeing that. But not only that, the victims or even the employees who went and blew the whistle, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their homes. Some of them come on, they speak to us, they're crying in tears that no one wants to touch me.
Yeah, it's more looking like crime pays, unfortunately. That is, Wayne is raising an important point, but all these things are not going to happen overnight. It took a longer period of time to get where we are. And unfortunately, it's going to take time for the law enforcement agencies and the judiciary to start kicking in, and we start seeing the results of what is actually going to happen. We are still waiting for the full report of the Zondo Commission, and we believe now that at the NPA there is a head of a person who's willing to actually and eager to prosecute based on evidence. You also don't want to rush, because when you rush and you don't have a conviction, we come back and sit here on the very same table and say, why rush when you don't have full evidence? So they're saying, let's get the full circumference of the evidence and be able to get convictions, and the law must be seen to be at work. And that is how it's supposed to happen. So I believe that with this time, there will be results, and people are waiting to see the results. But unfortunately, the law enforcement agencies have been hollowed out for the longer period of time. And it's not something that is going to be overnight. And you see a person in an orange overall, and then the next thing he's out, and then the state does not have sufficient evidence. There are recent cases that we're dealing with where states cannot, there are issues pertaining to evidence. They're saying we had a witness and now the witness is getting away. How do you deal with a situation like that when you are hinging your bets on one witness, and if that witness does not testify, you don't have a case? So that is the challenge that also the law enforcement agencies is finding itself, and also getting to the information, because you might get to the information when it's too late, when the information has been destroyed and you don't have a case. Because in law, you are not going to bring perceptions to the court. The judges, they need evidence. When you don't have evidence, people are going to walk out scot-free, and they will be shouting from the rooftop saying that we have told you that we were not guilty from the beginning. So I think this is the challenge that we face now.
Two things. I mean, I suppose there's no question at the level of expertise, for example, that our institutions have, like the Hawks, even though they were drained, of course, in the last couple of years. Some of those expertise, are they back in the system? Or the other question being raised is whether or not we have enough of them. So there is expertise, but there's just not enough men on the ground.
A lot of people also resigned at the NPA during the previous dispensation, and you saw what was actually happening at the Hawks during the time of Birmingham and the Menza, and what is actually currently happening now. So there's no sufficient capacity on the ground. The crime has overtaken everything, and now to restart the wheel, it's going to take a little bit of time. But my hope is that when we get the state capture report, then something will start happening, because there will be evidence. And there was amendments which the president introduced and said that this law enforcement agencies can then share the information, because in the past you were not going to bring evidence in court that comes from the state capture commission, because they were going to raise that this evidence is not admissible before court. So the amendment which the president did bring to say that these law enforcement agencies can be able to share information, and there will be harmonization of information. Let's believe that we'll start seeing something, and at the end of the day, then there will be real arrest, and there must be convictions that follow those arrests based on concrete evidence. Because, like I'm saying in court now, when you have got a case, they want evidence. They don't want anything else. They don't want hearsay evidence. They want real evidence that is going to bring conviction. That is what we're looking forward to.
Adila, how far wide are the networks that threaten the lives of whistleblowers? For example, the Babita Deokaran matter, the criminals could have been caught in that house that they were renting, and then they got arrested. And they are not the ones that were really implicated in the corruption. There are, of course, those who are paying them and getting them to do this. There were even reports that they are being intimidated, for example, while they are in prison. Are we getting to those networks more than the people who are paid to commit the crimes?
To be honest, I don't think there's sufficient that has been done to actually get to the real perpetrators. And it is unfortunate that those that have been paid to do the job are the ones that are sitting in prison, and those that actually paid for those services are free and are still within the employment of government. And, it is not limited to just government or public sector. I have clients that have been threatened, and in the private sector. They are working within the motor industry, they are working within the mining sector, and there's allegations that they have been threatened with their lives because they have exposed fraud and corruption within the industry. But again, there isn't sufficient action that's been taken against the perpetrators, and it's always the whistleblower that is being seen as the problem. And that is exactly where Athol William found himself, where he had to eventually flee the country. Recently, it's come to active citizens movement's attention that VLSA has uplifted the ban on bail. And we are none the wiser in terms of what was actually required of bail to become a good corporate citizen. Further, we are also questioning what is Bain doing to assist William? Are they going to reach out to him? Are they going to provide financial assistance? Are they going to provide security? These kind of steps are required in order to encourage whistleblowers to come forward and expose fraud and corruption in both private and public sector.
Yeah. What's the hope, Wayne? I mean, we're coming out of elections now with the hope that new parties are going to come in and maybe there'll be some change and there'll be some service delivery. But from what Adila is saying and from what we are generally getting a sense from various reports is that the dead wood is still in the system.
Yeah. You know, there's a saying that you can't leave people in charge of the solution who created the problem in the first place. And they might be moving the deck chairs on the Titanic here, but let's face it, we are not doing enough as a state in this country to fight corruption. And as we hear from the panelists tonight, we shouldn't be in this situation right now. We're struggling to still fight corruption. We're struggling to protect whistleblowers. Their livelihoods have been decimated, and it's hundreds of them. And we go back to the 2010 World Cup issues with the stadiums and that, and people were assassinated there, local government. The list goes on, and we sit here today still wondering how do we assist these whistleblowers? You know, you look at Martha Ngonya inside PRASA. She's been dismissed 3 times. She's had to go to court on her own steam, fight for her job to get back, and yet the Minister of Transport just continues to dismiss these good people inside this organization who are trying to protect PRASA from being decimated. And so right down to local government, as you say, we don't hold much hope that things are going to change. Coalition governments we've seen are very difficult, and the corruption is just going to be more centered around who gets the budgets of the big spend in these towns and cities. They divvy that out in the coalitions. We've seen that before, and they become problematic anyway. So we've got to do far more than what is being done. But civil society is pushing this issue uphill on its own instead of government creating an environment that says, and big business, by the way, that says, how do we assist people like Athol, people like Martha, people like many of them, Cynthia Stimple and so on, so that they don't have to go through the pain, they don't have to fight their own court cases, they can be able to be re-employed, they can be integrated back into society without the stigma attached or having to leave the country or to be murdered. And our government sits here with a lot of lip service, a lot of rhetoric, actually nothing is happening on the ground, and that's a disgrace. And they get into power on the ticket of being anti-corruption fighting, but they aren't.
1 or 2 examples very briefly, Wayne, of what length as civil society you've had to go to and what you're discovering in your documents of, for example, places that are not being touched as far as how wide these networks spread, and maybe just really focusing on the trigger pullers and getting them behind bars, but not actually following through on how far the matters should actually go.
Well, you know, I mean, we've laid treason charges against a number of ministers as far back as 2017. We provided evidence. This whole state capture project and the Gupta leaks. And by the way, you know, we don't have to wait till the Zondo Commission report comes out. These cases can run concurrently, and lots of cases and lots of hard evidence. I'm not talking about hearsay or media reports. Hard evidence has been provided to the authorities, and nothing happens. So I don't know what more we have to do as civil society, but we're pulling our hair out. Now, I think in this country we've got to do corruption fighting unusual. You know, we can't, in a normal country, in a normal environment, those people who assassinated Babita and the people who paid them would have been arrested by now, because let's face it, forensics and investigations, it's not rocket science. The evidence, the fingerprints, the digital fingerprints, the connectivities are all there to be followed up. The money flows are all there. The bank accounts are available. So, you know, we sit here giving all the excuses to why 2.5 years later, we know that these institutions have been hollowed out and they are short of skills. But there are hundreds of skills out there by the private sector, by civil society, from international bodies that will be here tomorrow, that will get involved if this government just pulls the trigger and says we're going to fight corruption meaningfully. But they don't. They give lip service, and we've got to do something different, because overseas and in other normal societies, all of these people, the big masses of amounts of money that's been wasted and thrown away, corruptly spent in state capture, they would have been behind bars a year ago. It's shocking.
Artist Wayne Duvenage, appreciate your time. Adila, Chohan, as well as Advocate Nthambeleni for coming through tonight.